and I work in the male medium secure services in Oxford. Jerry, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Jerry Akerman, so I work across the 4 prisons who are in Oxford Health, so that's HMP Grendon, Spring Hill, Bullingdon and Huntercombe.
And we're here to talk to you today about working with traumatised teams, and it's drawing on the work that we've done that will be in the book chapter, which we'll talk about a bit towards the end. So I wanted to start with a quote. If we can get the slides to move along. There we go. Hopefully everybody can see that. So this is from Sandra Bloom, has written quite a lot about how stress impacts on organisations. And I think it's a really useful quote to start with because I think it really nicely encapsulates this idea that you might have a team that appears to be working, but within it, that kind of chronic repetitive stress that we often find in forensic services is really pulling at the threads that hold that team together. So as an earthquake can cause the foundations of a building to become unstable, even while the building still stands apparently intact, so too does chronic repetitive stress destabilize the cognitive and affective foundations of a shared meaning that's necessary for a group to function and stay whole. So let's just talk a bit about what we're going to speak about today. So we want to discuss how trauma and fear propagates through a team, explore the kind of consequences for a traumatized team, what that has for service users, the staff members and the organization as a whole, how fear will then pass into the organization and might affect decision making within the service. We're also going to kind of draw together some of those themes and think about what interventions services might include or might want to make sure that they are embedding in their service. We really acknowledge that this is a work in progress. I'm sure there are many people who are tackling with this problem, and there'll be other ideas around that as well. So these are just some of the things that we have used and are continue to think about. So let's just think about the scale of the problem. So if we look at prison service staff, data from last year shows that there are over 10,000 assaults on staff in the 12-month period. And staff were exposed to probably twice that in terms of witnessing and managing prisoner-on-prisoner assaults. That's an increase of 8% overall from the previous year. In the NHS forensic services, the data is actually much harder to get. NHS Protect used to gather the data in 2016, but now you can't drill down enough to forensic services to find out what the level of incidents of violence are for staff. If we use our service, I mean, we're male and female, medium and low secure services, about 135 beds across 9 inpatient teams, plus prison service, in reach and OPD services. We had 1,562 incidents of violence in 2025. If we had a really gross approximation, there's about 6,000 inpatient forensic secure beds in the country, well, England and Wales. That works out at about 34,000 incidents of violence a year. So it's a significant problem. There has been some research on it. So Newman and colleagues found that racial and verbal abuse appears underreported in forensic settings, and that's something that we very much see as well. And then there was a 1-year study in 2015 that found that 99% of inpatient forensic staff had some sort of conflict with a patient, and around 70% of them had been assaulted in some fashion during that same period. So this job is unlike any others. There is significant exposure to stress, violence, and it forms part of the background of our environments that we work in. So what other impacts does this have on staff? Well, we know that, again, we can't drill down specifically to forensic services, but if we look at healthcare professionals and mental health care professionals specifically, 31% of them are reporting trauma-specific disorders. There's a UK survey in 2021. Now, if we compare that to the general population are reporting 4.7, 5.1% PTSD symptoms. So again, it's much more prevalent in healthcare staff. I don't think we have data on prison service staff specifically. Very much the case that the environments that we work in The social, the physical context, the relational, procedural security, all of those things are going to have a real impact on how people respond to the exposure to those stresses and that violence. And under that kind of adversity, that kind of constant turnover of chronic stress, there's going to be a high turnover of staff. We know that our staff, we're all trying to do our jobs under a kind of condition of demand doesn't seem to be going away. There's a resources seem to be reducing as well. So there's all those other, sort of existential challenges to services at the same time. I guess within prison services, the environment itself, there's a limited exposure to natural light. The buildings aren't always fit for purpose. The spaces aren't fit for kind of modern rehabilitative purposes. Sometimes unsanitary conditions. Prison working culture as well. There's a sort of low levels of staff autonomy. Staff report feeling undervalued, and the kind of negative experiences around diversity and inclusion. We do know that there's some evidence that professional development strategies it can kind of be supportive of staff resilience and reduce staff attrition. But as yet, there doesn't seem to be a strategy necessarily that's going to respond to or acknowledge the stress and the trauma that staff are being exposed to. Let's just think a minute about what a healthy team is before we think about what a team under a condition of stress might be. So we've used a definition here of a team as a group of people with a shared set of aims, goals, purposes. They've got a common sense of identity, team performance. It's a kind of multi-layered process. Individuals are going to engage with each other in different ways to kind of accomplish both the individual tasks and the team level tasks and goals. But I also want to think about what teams are like when they're functioning under conditions of stress or fear. And in the chapter, we've used work by Earl Hopper, who some of you may know, and specifically the book Traumatic Experiences in the Unconscious Life of Groups. And he talks about groups that are undergoing group therapy, but also work groups that are coming together for a particular task. And he notes that, in a healthy team functioning, there are different elements to that, that a team, in order to kind of integrate together, they recognize there has to be some interdependence between each other, and that we're coming together to provide a service or a task. In that, the group members have got an adequate role differentiation. We all know what our task is and what each other's people's tasks are. And that kind of promotes coordination and communication, and we kind of negotiate with each other those roles. And in that negotiation, it kind of generates a sense of cohesion, that we're all together in this particular task or providing this service. He also talks about something called normation, the idea that there's a set of shared beliefs, values, but also a maturity in the team to tolerate difference and disagreement without that affecting the cohesion, that the ebb and flow of people's normal sort of challenges and interpersonal relationships allow that cohesion to sort of come together, so that the team as a whole has a sense of structure, and that there's a commitment. There's a commitment to the values and task, and that's superordinate mostly to the individual needs within the group. We're in this together. This is what we are. This is what we do. The team communicates with each other in a respectful way that promotes continuity in that shared endeavour. And there's also a shared culture within the group, and that might be about humour and irony and behaviour. I'm sure my psychoanalytic colleagues will have read Hopper and are probably saying there's a lot more to it than that. And of course, there is a lot more to it than that, but I wanted to kind of draw that out for the purposes of this today. So in our journey, in Oxford Health's journey at looking at trauma-informed care, we started probably 6-7 years ago now. And one of the first things that we did was we wanted to understand what the staff experience was of trauma and trauma-informed care. And so we conducted a series of focus groups. We got quite carried away with ourselves and did 16 separate focus groups, about 150 individuals across the service, which generated a massive amount of really rich information. And I wanted to draw into you today, or show you some of the information that we've got about the idea about the traumatized team. So within that, our staff were reporting both direct and indirect violence and traumatic consequences for them. That there's a ripple effect, both in terms of themselves being victims of violence or abuse, but also seeing their colleagues and witnessing assaults on colleagues. Alongside that, the sort of vicarious trauma of being exposed to the things that patients might have done. That there were particular demographics, groups of staff who were particularly targeted, often around race and gender, and a sense amongst those staff that they weren't able to raise issues around racial abuse, or didn't feel safe raising those issues, or if they did raise it, that nothing specifically would happen. There was also concerns around particular members of staff who might be targeted from specific patients. In terms of the consequences on the staff, there's a kind of huge range of responses, from people talking about the impact on work, that they just sort of had to get through it, that they felt that there was often a sense of withdrawing from the patients. They talked about a tendency to rely much more on procedure and more custodial thinking and a more custodial culture being developed. There was also impacts on the team, often within the team, and finding splits within the team and being less able to challenge those splits. And there were also, in some cases, overt symptoms of PTSD and trauma, so dissociation, flashbacks, etc., within the team. So quite a wide range, but quite a significant feedback from the staff teams. Although we started talking about trauma generally, they're very much focused on their own trauma. And our sense as a service was, unless we started to address this, they weren't going to be in a position to take on board and address the trauma that the patients were bringing into the service. There's also some systemic factors that they reported as well. So a feeling of lack of support, a sense of management letting them down, some resentment towards patients, some people reporting workplace triggers, and the unpredictability of it all, really. I've got some quotes here from them, which I think also kind of shows the kind of experiences that they had. Seeing things that you can't see, it's got a ripple effect. The only predictable thing is that something horrible will happen. You have to get on with it. I have to deal with it on my own. I don't want to burden anyone else. Am I incompetent because I can't deal with it? It's part of the job. We just go back to things that can re-traumatize you potentially without realizing it. Our service also noted that we had a wide range of staff support mechanisms in place, but they weren't being accessed by anybody in forensic services. And one of the issues that they repeatedly said was that they didn't want to go to it because the people offering it had never worked in forensic services and didn't know what it was like. So overall, from that, we found an increase in avoidance from patients, a focus on procedural rather than relational security. Sickness increased, particularly in areas where there's a greater acuity. There was a reduction in retention, greater use of agency staff and bank staff, which sort of weakened the relational bonds because they didn't necessarily know the patients. The groups are sort of losing their identity and coherence. There was a sense of a lack of containment in terms of the psychological, emotional, relational experiences of staff. We also noticed that they tended to stop being curious or stop being innovative, so very much in a freeze or survival state. Poorer decision making, often quite emotionally driven and action driven decision making. And a tendency for operational oversight, so senior management to get much more involved, but unusually, that typically wouldn't resolve the problems. So let's just think for a second then about what happens in teams and how we might think about that process of how trauma acts on teams. So one of the things that we know around why people come together, why groups come together, is often in the face of threats, because from an evolutionary point of view, people coming together tended to give us better resources, better outcomes. So we kind of overcome our anxiety of being around other people because we find safety in each other. So there is this idea of social buffering, that our kind of stress responses are reduced or mitigated simply by the presence of others. And we know actually from the evidence that there's better recovery from aversive experiences. Teams that have a sense of greater psychological safety tend to be more resilient. There's evidence, neurochemical evidence. So in groups that have a strong sense of identity, that being in the presence of each other, the oxytocin goes up and cortisol gets suppressed. Connection to others help us not feel overwhelmed. If we also think about that from a kind of trauma-informed point of view, the idea of co-regulation, we know that sort of helping others, being around others, calming each other's tends to help people return to a state of emotional regulation, brings people back within the window of tolerance via a whole range of interpersonal, physical, relational mirroring, everything from our vocal cadence to our body shape, how we feel. And I'm sure all of us have had that experience of being with a patient who's highly distressed or very emotionally expressive, and being able to sort of bring them down with our own therapeutic style, how we come across to them. There's also the work of Stephen Porges around a sort of attuning to each other, helps regulate our nervous system through these different signals of safety. But if we turn that round, what's the reverse of that in a team? So we can also have this thing about emotional contagion, that panic in groups can spread, particularly where there's a sort of weak social cohesion. So where groups don't have a strong sense of identity, panic seems to spread much more quickly through that. And it might spread in the presence of kind of what we call higher order cues, but much more overt threats. In those situations, human beings tend to make poor decisions. We tend to make decisions much more based upon dealing with the threat, or emotionally driven decisions. If there's co-regulation, there's also co-dysregulation. So that failure to mutually regulate emotions triggers us rather than soothes us. Everything gets amplified rather than dampening. We start to match each other's escalating emotional states, and there's a sort of mutual escalation and sort of downward spiral. Our experience has been, it's not solely the case that leadership solves this. I'm not saying it does, but it tends to be much more likely that this occurs in the absence of kind of containing leadership. That doesn't necessarily mean it has to be, the sort of official leader, but it can be with those people within the group who offer that sense of containment, which we'll come back to in a minute. Okay. So I wanted to point to the work of Sandra Bloom, because she was the one who started the quote that we started the presentation with, and she wrote a series of papers in 2004 through to 2006, which in part was sort of responding to the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, and it's a really interesting set of papers to think about how stress and chronic stress impacts on organizations and groups and society generally, and it's things that we can still see being played out today. In those situations where groups are under a sense of threat, or have more sense of fear within themselves, they tend to look towards strong leadership. And in that strong leadership, the way in which they will think about the threats or the fears tends to become much more polarized. And the reason, the idea that she puts forward, is the reason why it becomes polarized is because by polarizing it, we're much more likely to take action. By saying it's either this or this, it drives us towards action rather than a much more rational or thought-orientated response or patient response. That strong leadership, strong polarization pushes towards action and doing something to remove the source of the stress or the fear. Similarly, although not quite the same, Hopper also talks about what happens in groups and work groups when they are under a state of stress or fear or trauma within them. He talks about forces of incohesion. And he notes that there's different sets, or there's different ways in which teams may respond, and they'll shift from one to the other. So the first one is this idea of aggregation, that the teams will become a group of individuals, isolates. So they'll be much more likely to split. There won't be a coordinated response to what that fear may be, or what that trauma may be. So that the group sense of cohesion as itself starts to weaken. Alternatively, they may start to act like a mass, and they will start to externalize this problem and project it onto this leader who they, expect to be omnipotent and fix the problem. And of course, no leaders are omnipotent or able to often fix the problem, and so they will fail. And so that again will distance them from a sense of safety. Again, I've recognized I've massively summarized the work of Hopper there. So how do we know where a team is in terms of its team trauma? As far as we're aware, there aren't any specific measures or atmosphere scales around team trauma. None that we've noticed, unless any's come out in the last few years. If anybody's interested in developing one, or is already developing one, I'd really like to talk to you. It'd be really helpful. There are things like essences which might look at sort of therapeutic hold or the culture within a team. There are relational security scales as well that can be used. You might also look at proxy measures like sickness, or the recruitment and retention of staff. My experience has been that exit interviews are really poor. We don't often understand why people leave the service. Certainly not enough value, in enough detail to understand why that is. For me, it's much more about observational markers. What do I see in a team? So it's things like this, that this is adapted from Francis, who was looking at organizational trauma rather than group or team trauma. Things like a sense of stuckness. I think that comes from that sense of disempowerment that we often see in people who are experiencing trauma. That sense of sort of the freeze experience, really. There's a rigidity sometimes in those teams, an unwillingness to change things, because that also brings greater anxiety. So a much greater push towards procedural security rather than relational security. Denial and disconnection within the team and external to the team. Sometimes we see cynicism and a sort of reduction in hope and compassion. Very much get a them and us around, external vilification of the management teams, or it might be the senior management team, and a bit of a kind of internal idealization sometimes, and also presenteeism, people being there but not offering, not being able to offer much, or being unable to feel like that they can leave actually. So what can we do with teams in this sort of situation? Well, obviously we've talked a bit about containment. We mentioned that, this idea around people holding each other's emotional experience, and the way in which we pass it to one another. In our service, we went through a period where in our male medium acute service, we had a particular individual who's very assaultive towards staff. We ended up having the police in a number of times to resolve situations. Very tricky for the staff teams. And in that particular case, it was very difficult to gain a sense of containment for them. It was even an extreme example for us, I think, as a forensic services. And there was not, no matter how much leadership containment we were offering, it was never going to be enough to manage the assaults that they were being exposed to. But the leaders need to be attuned. They need to be attuned to that process, to be aware of their responsibility and attuned to the survival mechanisms that are being played out in the team. It can't just be somebody who is there from a procedural point of view. They've got to be there from a relational point of view, just as we need to be with our patients. But we note that they need enough distance from the team to not be engulfed, to not not be co-dysregulated by the team, but they need to be close enough to have enough legitimacy and credibility with the team for them to gain a sense of containment from them. So they need to know the team and be accessible to them, be able to support them, notice what's happening and process that fear, but not get drawn into fixing the problem. There's a tendency, I think, sometimes for leaders to swan in and fulfill that omnipotent leader role and take action, when actually that action might be just as easily done by other members of the team, who would then gain some confidence and feel more empowered in doing that. So making sure that they're not necessarily always fixing the problem, supporting the team to demonstrate their own agency and competence in dealing with some of those challenges. Obviously, we need to have safer connections. Connection is really the key to managing fear. And I know most services that are here visiting will have safety huddles, reflective practice, start the day, team building, lots of places where they will connect with each other. But spaces can also be places to communicate fear. So that emotional contagion that we talked about. So they need facilitators who are, connected enough to the group to have that credibility adjacent to it, ideally not part of the line management or not having overt power or authority over the group as a whole. Because that invites, again, that process of the omnipotent leader or the omnipotent facilitator who's going to try and fix things. So we need facilitators who's going to help those connections build and talk about their experiences and process some of those experiences together. In the act of doing that itself will form greater connection and cohesion in the group. Obviously, those meetings, those spaces need to have regular commitment, and they need to have MDT commitment. Splitting within the team needs to be noticed, discussed, with a neutral approach. It's part of the normal group processes, part of the normal process of working in the environments that many of us do. The other thing I want to mention about sort of creating safer connections is about shared narratives following incidents. So I think most services will have some form of debriefing process, probably a hot debrief following an incident, which might be about making sure operationally everybody's safe and that procedures are followed and so forth. But there'll often be a later cold debrief. And in that cold debrief, it's often the case that people don't know the whole story, that they don't know the whole narrative of the incident. They might just know their bit of it. And sharing that narrative around the group, around the team, again, helps bring back a sense of cohesion. This is what happened. This is how we responded to it. This is how we are working our way through it. So again, making sure that shared narrative is a really important part of an opportunity to reconnect and recohere together. Just watching the time. Psychological safety. There's lots to be read about psychological safety, and you should read the work of Edmondson. There's a really good TED talk that she does around that. There are a series of questions that she's asked in some of her work that I found quite useful in away days or in teams. You don't have to phrase them quite this way. You can phrase them in a different way if you want to. But if you make a mistake in the team, is it held against you? Are members of the team able to bring up problems and tough issues? Do people on the team reject each other for being different? Is it safe to take a risk on this team? Is it difficult to ask other members of the team for help or support? And one of the things that, if we go back to our case, our focus groups, teams very much felt that they couldn't talk about their experience to each other, even though they were all experiencing it, because they didn't want to burden each other. But some of them didn't want to be seen as being vulnerable because of the impact that might have on the team. So being able to have those conversations and gaining strength together from those conversations is really, really important, but it's obviously really, really hard when you're in those situations of fear and stress. There are some systemic factors, I think, as well, that need to be in place for some of this work to happen. So obviously we've talked about the idea of these sort of safe spaces for staff to reflect in their experiences to break the chain. We're developing some trauma-informed leadership and teamship programs. It's still a bit of a way to go, but those I think will help highlight some of these factors that we're talking about, really help teams tune into them. And the teamship element is about also helping the teams themselves recognize that, helping them gain some agency and control and competence around noticing those processes happening within themselves. Obviously, making sure that supervision reflective practice is trauma informed. We've also developed trauma informed case discussions. That's another place to come together and have a sense of connection. We use TRIM. I don't know if other services use TRIM, trauma risk management, which is an approach to individual support of staff following incidents. I think we've gone through various phases with that, but at the moment seems to be working really well. So everybody who's involved in an incident is offered TRIM by default, so they have to opt out of it. We have about just under a 50% take up with TRIM. And that, again, on an individual basis, gives people an opportunity to sort of normalize their responses to incidences. Alongside that, and I think this is something that we're still struggling with, is making sure that there are a developing restorative practice culture around that, so that if people have been victims of assaults and they're then having to come back onto a ward and then look after the person that's assaulted them, that there should be some restorative process to manage that. I think we have some way to go with that, and it should be sitting alongside TRIM. But also, I think it goes without saying that we're trying to develop a rehabilitative culture, and it's hard changing culture. The last thing, one of the last things that I want to just talk about, and we'll have a bit of time for questions, is that change comes, cultural change comes from a range of different things. Yes, we can change systemic things and factors, but actually it comes from that, the multitude of different interactions between people. So we developed this sort of one small thing initiative in our trauma informed group, asking everybody to consider what's one small act of change they've contributed to the service that might be trauma informed. And we've had a real range of different examples, many of which we've then gone on to say, yes, actually, well, that's a really good idea. Let's take that elsewhere. The idea being that all these small things aggregated together will bring about much more cultural change. And I think even now we're 6-7 years into it, we are still starting to much more feel a greater sense towards it being a trauma informed service. We've still got some way to go, but we are making progress in that direction. So I want to finish by inviting you all to consider what one small thing you've done to support your service to become trauma informed. You don't need to tell us here, but note it to yourself and perhaps go and ask your colleagues about it. As ever, we're talking about trauma. So if you're affected by anything that's been discussed today, there's some helplines there for you. And also, of course, we want to promote the book that's coming out soon. I think Phil will tell you when, but I've discovered that Routledge have got the cover on there, so I stole a picture of that so we can see what it looks like. So that will be coming out earlier, I think March time, Phil, maybe. And also Jerry, who's not had a chance to speak because I've been busy rattling on, runs the Let's Talk Forensic Psychology podcast, so do listen into that. So I've rattled on quite quickly, but that does give us a bit of time for questions. So anybody got any questions? I'll stop sharing. Yep, see if I can get the camera on.
Thanks. Yeah. So we've got about 20 minutes or so for questions. I've got about 100 people still in the meeting. So yeah, if you can stick your hand up, and maybe if you can stick your camera on just so we can see a face. Tracy, you got a question?
Thank you. That was a really superb presentation. I really enjoyed it. I'd like to ask, given some of the very systemic limitations, you've talked a lot about culture and so on and so forth, how possible do you think true relational repair is in those sorts of environments with all the restrictions?
That's a great question. And I think with anything, it's going to be one that It's going to vary depending upon so many different possible influences on that process. I think trauma-informed care brings a much greater focus to it. And I particularly, in terms of this, I think it particularly highlights the tendency for teams to move from a relational approach to a procedural and custodial approach when they feel like they're under conditions of threat. And it's fear. It's not just trauma, it's fear. Because it's often the anticipation of these things happening again. And it's that I think we need to wrestle with. I think if you can get teams talking about it in a way that feels contained and feels safe, then they're in a much better position to have those kind of, resolve some of those relational challenges. If they're not, and they're feeding each other, then I think it's a real struggle. So I do think it very much, though, all of those opportunities to come together. If I go to a safety huddle, and there's a sense of this is really challenged, but we've got this. This is, we're able to do this. That gives me greater confidence that they're going to be relational in the way that they think about it. And I've certainly seen that to be the case. It's not always the case. Obviously, these things ebb and flow. But yeah, does that kind of answer your question? There's no clear answer, I'm afraid. It's just
It does. It's really helpful and just gives me some ideas about kind of steps forward as well. Thank you.
Yeah.
And also, if we just sort of add, if we can, because obviously we're trying to role model relationships and ruptures and healing ruptures of relationships, the more people can see us doing that, and the more we become familiar with doing that, the more likely we will do with the people we're working with. And we've talked quite a bit about the restorative practices, in this case, usually in hospitals, but the cost of moving a patient and the lack of somewhere to move them to, and the disruption that causes, is really helped by not having to do that, and them learning, because we'll all learn by healing ruptures and relationships. And so that's a really valuable sort of a 2-for-1 offer in a way, that they're learning the skill, but also, not being damaged further, because often people can feel really bad about having done it, but not have an outlet to say sorry, or not feeling a way of doing it without losing face is often a thing. So if this is sort of offered and they can take it up, it's a valuable skill for people to learn, for the staff and for the resident.
Yeah.
And there's lots of evidence it works. I mean, they've doing systematic reviews and reviewing how does, and it's called cutting sickness times, this sort of thing. So it's really important, like with the TRIM practitioners, using that sort of our peers to support each other. That is, reducing sickness and helping people to stay in the job, which is what we're all trying to do. We don't want people damaged by being in these jobs.
Yeah. Just in terms of the TRIM practitioners, as I said earlier, our staff team weren't using, the multitude of different offers in our trust for staff support. They just weren't using them. There was, we hadn't had a staff psych service referral for 5 years from forensic services, but with TRIM meant that it's peer support, and so the people that they were talking to know what it's like being in forensic services, and that's had a massive impact on that, and it's much, take up's much greater. I really do think that's for us, it's been one of the successes.
And I think it normalises that's what you should be doing. It's not like an unusual thing to do. It's an expectation that you would do it rather than you wouldn't do it.
Yeah.
And we have all psychiatrists, everybody uses it. It's not just sort of feel that it's fun, everybody tries to sort of model, but actually benefits from using the service.
And also those TRIM practitioners within the service become a sort of ad hoc trauma-informed champions as well.
Right. There's a question in the chat from Rachel Cullen. Does restorative justice involve patients as well who were involved in the incident?
Yeah, very much so. If obviously if they consent to do it, and if they consent to have a meeting, then that will take place. But if not, they'll be very much involved, and that's very much the aim. But our restorative practice has been patient, staff, patient, staff. So it's been a whole range of different things.
Okay. I had a question about, I guess you've talked a lot about sort of bottom-up trauma that comes from patients, and I was thinking that I suppose there's also the kind of top-down threat that comes from, I suppose, from the top about, trust boards who are, under threat from negative CQC reports and financial pressures and so on. I suppose, are the interventions any different for dealing with those top-down threats?
I know. I don't think they are. I think there's a challenge, I think, in the operational management leadership style and teams to recognise that trauma affects them just as much as it does everybody else, and that it just because they're not directly involved in patient care doesn't mean that they're not seeing incident reports every day or having to manage quite significant vicarious trauma. I think I certainly had conversations with our senior management team about the impact of how trauma will push them towards action when sometimes they don't need action. They need to sit and think and process first. So I think there is a recognition of that. I think it might be something in the language though about how you approach them. I think so. There's the same themes, but it might be a slightly different frame for them.
Yeah,
and also they have different pressures as well. They might know about cuts to the service and things. They have to contain that, and I sometimes see it with new managers who don't quite know how to contain that, so they'll start talking about things that haven't really been decided, and it just causes anxiety amongst everybody, and you sort of feel you need to contain that until it's been decided and can be how it's been decided to be discussed with people. So you sort of, it's this learning curve, isn't it, for new people to learn those sorts of things and realise, and their managers might not be around to see it happening. So you find it a way of feeding it back to their manager to say, actually, you're probably not aware, but this is what's happening, because you're sort of protecting each other as teams, aren't you, when we're in a multidisciplinary team, and that we're not in the line management structure of other people that we work with. But yeah, so there was a question about an incident. One of our colleagues is on, Catherine Mousel. She's one of the people that's been doing the research with Rich on this. But so if there was a case where somebody had assaulted, for instance, a member of staff, they would be a bit like restorative justice would be, with a prisoner and somebody in the community. They would sit down together, it'd be planned, and they would talk together, it'd be contained, but they'd get a chance to talk about how they felt, and the member of staff would as well. It's very well managed, and then it's by trained people.
So restorative practice approaches are, we've had some success. I think we had some ongoing challenges at embedding it, which has nothing to do with restorative practice and more to do with just resources and money.
Yeah.
There's a question about what a trauma-informed case discussion is. And again, that you might do it differently in the hospital than we do it in the prison. So I don't know who wants to go first.
I mentioned that we've had case discussions and case formulation sessions in teams for quite some time, but we noticed that they didn't really have much of a format. And one of the dangers with that, I think, is that as a psychologist coming in and doing the formulation might be seen as a sort of expert, and that doesn't actually prompt a lot of curiosity. So we've structured some questions, the sort of based on the power threat meaning framework, but thinking about how trauma acts on people and then how we respond to that person's. So it's a series of questions that invite the team to be curious, as a sort of protocol, and we're in the middle of trialing that as an inpatient service with a bit of an evaluation. So if people are interested, then I'll give you my details and people can get in touch, and I'm happy to share it with people so you can have a look at it.
Yeah, in a similar way, we were just trying to think about when we're talking about it might be current behaviour, we would be thinking what of this might be trauma, as opposed to just somebody being difficult, or we'd always try and take that step back by looking at the different sort of how it might offence parallel and that sort of thing, looking to see what's going on, or trauma parallel from what's happened to them in the past. So it's keeping it in mind really, and not just judging what somebody's just done and why they might have done it.
The question that we found been really useful in that for teams is to ask, what is this person doing to make themselves feel safe? And I think that's been a really helpful question for teams to think about, particularly if somebody is being assaultive or aggressive or violent, that is something that they might be doing to make themselves feel safe. And understanding that, I think, has really sort of changed some of the thinking a little bit.
And there's a question which it says, while TRIM has been implemented well within the service, and you mentioned restorative practice is slower, but both interventions can be joined, what would you say needs to improve to use restorative practice within the service?
That's not from Catherine, is it, by any chance? Who I think he's on the call and
No,
he's
it's
our
not.
restorative
It's
just lead.
Jasmine.
Okay. Well, I mean, honestly, and brutally, it's money. We've been lucky enough to get some business case money. So we trained 50 people on restorative practice, but in order to take it forward for us, we need okay, Jasmine, yeah. I understand. Catherine is your research supervisor. It is money, actually. I think the argument is there, but it needs, I mean, there is, and this is you, Jasmine, actually, the research needs to be strong enough that we can make the argument for more resources to do it. Not to put any pressure on you, Jasmine. Back to you.
Michelle has her hand up.
I was just smiling at that. Yeah, so my kind of reflection and question combined was going back to that point around leadership teams and that top-down pressure, because my reflection is that so sitting attempting to do pieces of culture work in a high secure environment, which is really large, it's like multiple hospitals in one, and noticing and observing the senior leadership team almost getting that double whammy, actually, of top down and bottom up pressure. And actually that's really tricky to manage, because what I observe is a rolling kind of urge for action, but actually that even when that settles at some point and you get a microcosm of a reflective window of opportunity to start thinking about and touching into the, you know, kind of emotional labour and the feelings that might be held there, actually there's another something that comes from either direction, and then there's a repeated urge for action. So it's just a reflection about actually it's they're squashed in the middle, they get it from both ends. And I think what we're not great in terms of considering and having kind of models for in a great way is how we manage that at a senior leadership level, and even at the kind of C-suite level. I don't think we've got very far really in thinking about that from an organisational trauma-informed practice. But the thing that's connected that I wanted to ask you a question about was going back to that, and I suppose it's a reflection around the ecosystem and Bronfenbrenner's model, because I think that's really helpful when you're thinking about kind of culture initiatives. And it's that point about particular demographics that might increase an experience of trauma, and thinking particularly around race, because that's some work that I'm doing at the moment. Have you got any ideas about how we manage that kind of macro system that sits around? So it's not from execs in a trust or governors in a prison coming down, it's actually wider than that, because actually there's elements of that we have no control over. So I wrangle with that, and there's a patient at the end of that and a staff at the end of that I try and wrangle with, and the layers of that feel really unwieldy at times. So I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts about it.
I mean, I think, Michelle, there's no easy answer for that, is it? It's a wicked problem, as they call it, and I think the race issue is particularly challenging. We find it in our service. It's an ongoing issue, and supporting staff through processes like contacting the police and making sure there are convictions for those sort of behaviors. That's such a challenge to try and do that. I haven't really got an answer. What I will say is that this trauma-informed leadership program that we're developing is going to try and answer some of those things, and we're not there yet. I really like what you're saying about the senior management team are often sort of in between. And I sat on a senior management team, and you're sort of constantly feeding the beast from above, whilst also keeping your eye on what's happening underneath. And I think one of the challenges that I wrestled with when I was in that position was making sure that I'm not robbing people's agency by fixing that problem and getting drawn into that action position. And so I think there is something about that particular dynamic, and being able to challenge that is really helpful. It's uncomfortable because it looks like you're not responding to the need, but actually the need needs to sit somewhere, and they need to be supported rather than told how to do it or had it fixed by somebody else. So I think
that's really helpful, and it speaks to that relational
yeah,
modeling, doesn't it?
yeah,
Because actually a conversation around that
yeah,
actually can help.
yeah,
That's the reason you're not jumping into fixing.
yeah,
The other thing, I loved the bit in the slide around it's almost like that idea of we are the system, so every
yeah,
one action has an
yeah,
impact on the system, and I think that's been our beginning point for how we tackle some of the racial trauma,
yeah,
is
yeah,
case by case basis and making
yeah,
sure it's through every level,
yeah,
because we learn as we go then.
yeah.
Yeah,
Embed
thank
it
you.
everywhere. Yeah.
Yeah.
Chantal has a
Chantal,
question.
yeah.
Yes, thank you. So yes, hello, Jerry and others.
Lovely to
So
see you.
yeah, it's nice to see you too. I feel a bit of an imposter because I used to work in prisons and I now work in acute mental health trust. But this is really highly relevant.
Yeah.
And my question is, in terms of working in quite polytraumatized teams where acuity is really high. They are obviously a non-forensic service, but where they are targeted to move people on really quickly. So
Yeah.
building relationships is really difficult. So
Yeah.
they'll have somebody come in for 2 weeks, and the person's there's high acuity, and then they have to manage a lot of problem for them. Challenging or behaviors that challenge, and so you get a lot of compassion fatigue. And it's
Yeah.
like, where do you get the opportunity? It's difficult to get the opportunity to have a space to sort of breathe from one to the other because the pace is really fast.
Yeah.
So this is just an observation, and also, any thoughts?
I mean, I think our services have changed. I'm sure other people working in forensic services may say similar, but the turnover of patients has changed. And I've been at Oxford for 13 years, and the turnover of patients has changed quite a lot. So I do get your sense of that acuity, that turnover of patients. And what I think one of the things I notice about that is that lack of curiosity, because staff aren't going to invest the time in somebody who's only going to be there for a short period of time. And so finding ways of helping them be curious, because it benefits them, because if they're better positioned to understand the patient, then they're be in a better position to respond. So I think sometimes it might be worth helping them understand the benefit of understanding. It's not just for the patient's benefit, but also for their own benefit in terms of being able to predict and have good conversations with people. So there might be something there that could be worth exploring. But I agree. We've got colleagues in our PQ, and they've said similar sort of things to me about this. It's a real challenge with the turnover.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful.
Okay.
Sorry,
Richard.
did I see a comment there from Anna, who I used to work with many
Yes.
moons ago?
There is, yes. If Anna's still here, actually, I don't know if you want to ask a question, Anna.
Oh, yes, sorry, I am still here, but my camera isn't working. Thank you. It's great to see Rich.
Good to hear.
I'm
Good to hear
working
from
in
you.
a women's prison right now. And I
Yeah.
guess when I did the organizational consultancy work at the Tavistock, there was an idea, I mean, that was part of our module for training, that there was an idea that managers in role as managers in reflective practice is super helpful because it stops all the externalizing of blame. Oh, it's all them up there who aren't listening. And it also allows open communication. Now, there was a school of thought that says that if you have managers in reflective practice, nobody's going to say anything and it's going to be a very different conversation. And sometimes managers use that as a reason to do something very different. I just wondered what your views were on that. It's been a fantastic talk. So thank you very much. Really relevant.
Thanks, Anna. It's a tricky one, isn't it? Because I think that, as I said, I think the person who's providing the containing sometimes needs to be adjacent, or needs to be there, but to be credible, but not so much so that they get engulfed in that. And I think that I would say that I've noticed managers have different approaches to that. Some are closer than others, and those that are closer tend to be able to be in reflective practice and it not impact upon the reflective practice process. But I've seen the opposite as well. I I think it's important that they get reflective practice. That's the one thing I can be sure of. Whether or not that is part of their team reflective practice, I think the jury's still out. I've seen it work well. I've seen it work badly. I think they need to be in a position to manage that themselves.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I guess you're saying it depends upon the kind of managerial style,
Yeah.
but maybe we can, or you can develop some kind of training for managers so that it's a way they can participate and hear the concerns of the staff without necessarily fixing the problem then and there.
Or inhibiting them. Yeah.
Or inhibiting them equally. Thank you.
It's about 1 minute to 3. There's, I think we may have skated over. So, well, there's actually kind of multiple questions from Darla in the text. So I don't know whether you can answer these questions in a kind of very briefly, possibly not. I'll read them out one at a time. So, given there are times when fear is high and times when fear is lower but still present, can you talk about how increasing that ability to co-regulate or build cohesion progresses on teams steeped in fear? In other words, what would be tackled first?
What would be tackled first in that situation? What would be tackling first in that situation? I mean, I think it's not a tackling first. So it's about a package of things of involvement that should be continuous. So I think that you would be stepping up or stepping down the co-regulation within those different opportunities to come together and noticing the fear going up and down, noticing the acuity changing. So it would be about being responsive to that rather than it being a sort of linear process. Does that make sense? Hopefully, Darla.
Okay.
So as long as you've got those processes in place, it's going to be responsive to it. It's going to notice that change and then respond and then co-regulate back down again.
Okay.
We'd always seem to try and go to the hottest things first.
Yeah.
And then gradually go to the things that are simmering. We don't always get to those. So.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to make this the last question. I think someone else just put something in. Can you give an example of an incidence of restorative justice and what strategies are employed when the person repeatedly engages in the behaviour?
Good question. A person who would be great to answer that question if she's still in the thing is my colleague Catherine. But we probably haven't got time to give an example of restorative justice. Perhaps we should. I know she's coming to do a session on nature well.
Yes, come back in. I forget when, but yeah, soon in the next.
I'm not going to volunteer to come and talk about restorative justice, but it'd be great if she would. I'm sure she's going to be cursing me for that. But I think that that would be a really good thing to talk about. But I don't think we've got time in a minute for me to give an example of that. do it anywhere near credit.
Okay. Any thoughts about what to do with kind of repeat offenders?
You just have to kind of keep repeating the process.
Right.
Expect it really.
Yeah.
It's the nature of the work, and each time you do it, they'll learn from it, won't they? They will learn something.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Brilliant. Okay, so we're past 3 o'clock. I'm gonna draw things to a close. Thank you, Richard and Jerry, for a really fascinating presentation.